In the winter of 1928, a young woman arrived at Carl Jung's consulting room in Küsnacht on the shores of Lake Zurich. She was well-educated, articulate, and, by all outward appearances, composed. She had been referred by a colleague who described her as a model patient, cooperative, insightful, eager to improve. Yet after 2 years of conventional analysis, she had made almost no progress. Her presenting complaint was a persistent feeling of emptiness, a sense that she was living someone else's life. She described herself as kind, patient, generous, and selfless. She could not understand why, despite embodying all the virtues she had been taught to cultivate, she felt so profoundly disconnected from herself. Jung listened carefully, but his attention was drawn not to what the woman said about herself, but to what she did not say. In his notes from that first session, he wrote something that would become central to his understanding of the human psyche. She has constructed a self so perfect that no room remains for the person she actually is. This observation would lead Jung down a path of investigation that would reshape how we understand human personality, self-deception, and the terrifying process of becoming whole. And it was through an unlikely tool, a deck of illustrated cards, that the breakthrough would eventually come. Jung had been developing his concept of the shadow for several years by this point. The idea was deceptively simple, yet profoundly disturbing. Every person, Jung proposed, carried within their unconscious mind a figure he called the shadow. This was not a metaphor for evil, though it was often experienced that way. Rather, the shadow was the sum total of everything a person had rejected, repressed, denied, or hidden from their conscious awareness. It was, in essence, the unlived life. Everything a person could be but refused to be. Everything they felt but refused to feel. Everything they desired but refused to desire. The shadow was not separate from the person, it was the person, or at least a fundamental part of them, that had been pushed into darkness. The creation of the shadow, Jung observed, was not a pathological process, it was a necessary one. Every child, in the process of growing up, learned what was acceptable and what was not. A boy who was told that anger was wrong learned to suppress his aggression. A girl who was taught that ambition was unfeminine learned to hide her desire for power and achievement. A child raised in a family that valued intellectual accomplishment learned to reject the playful, spontaneous, emotional aspects of their nature. These rejected qualities did not disappear. They were pushed into the unconscious, where they formed the shadow, a dark twin that grew more powerful the more it was denied. The young woman in Jung's consulting room was a perfect illustration of this process. She had been raised in a family where goodness was the highest value. Anger, selfishness, ambition, sexuality, anything that could be construed as dark or unpleasant had been systematically suppressed. She had learned her lessons well. By adulthood, she had constructed a persona, a public mask, that was virtually flawless. She was kind to everyone. She never expressed anger. She put others' needs before her own without exception. She was, by every conventional measure, a good person. But the cost of this perfection was enormous. By rejecting every dark or difficult aspect of her nature, she had also rejected her vitality, her passion, her authentic desires, and, ultimately, her sense of self. The emptiness she described was not a lack of something she had never possessed. It was the absence of everything she had spent a lifetime pushing away. Her shadow, swollen with decades of repressed material, had grown so large that it was consuming her from within. Jung's initial attempts to address the shadow through conventional analysis proved frustrating. When he suggested that she might harbor feelings of anger or resentment, she politely disagreed. When he pointed out that her selflessness might contain elements of control or superiority, she became confused. The woman's defenses were so sophisticated, so deeply ingrained, that direct confrontation with her shadow was nearly impossible. Her conscious mind had become expert at deflecting any information that contradicted its carefully constructed self-image. It was during this impasse that Jung turned to an approach he had been quietly developing. He had been studying the tarot for several years, not as a divination tool, but as what he called a symbolic vocabulary of the unconscious. He had noticed something remarkable about the tarot's major arcana. Unlike most symbolic systems, which tended to emphasize light, goodness, and transcendence, the tarot gave equal weight and dignity to dark, difficult, and frightening images. The devil, death, the tower, the moon. These cards did not shy away from depicting the aspects of human experience that most people preferred to ignore. What interested Jung most was people's reactions to these cards. He had observed a consistent pattern. Individuals who encountered the tarot for the first time almost always had strong, aversive reactions to specific cards. Some recoiled from the devil. Others could not look at the tower without anxiety. The moon card provoked unease in many. The death card, despite its well-known symbolic meaning of transformation, still triggered visceral fear in most people who encountered it. Jung began to suspect that these reactions were not random. They were, he theorized, direct encounters with the shadow. His reasoning was characteristically precise. If the shadow consisted of everything a person had rejected from their conscious identity, then encountering a symbol that represented those rejected qualities should produce a strong emotional reaction. The intensity of the reaction would be proportional to the degree of repression. A person who had completely denied their capacity for destruction would react most strongly to the tower. A person who had suppressed their sexuality or their connection to instinct would find the devil card unbearable. A person who had rejected the unknown, the ambiguous, the uncertain aspects of life would be most disturbed by the moon. Jung decided to test this theory with his young patient. He laid out the 22 major arcana cards on the table between them and asked her simply to look at each one and describe what she felt. He instructed her not to analyze the cards or assign them intellectual meaning, but simply to notice her emotional and physical responses. The results were immediate and dramatic. The woman moved through most of the cards with relative ease. She admired the beauty of the star. She felt warmth looking at the Empress. She appreciated the wisdom suggested by the Hierophant. But when she reached the card known as the Devil, something changed. Her face became rigid, her breathing quickened. She pushed the card away from her with a gesture that was almost violent, the most physically forceful movement Jung had observed from her in months of sessions. When asked to describe what she felt, she could only say that the card made her feel dirty and that she did not want to look at it. Jung noted this reaction with great interest but did not press the point immediately. Instead, he asked her to continue through the remaining cards. Her reaction to the tower was similarly intense, though expressed differently. Rather than pushing the card away, she became very still, almost frozen, staring at the image of the crumbling tower struck by lightning. When asked what she felt, she said the word deserved. It was an odd response, and when Jung asked her to elaborate, she seemed surprised by her own answer and could not explain what she had meant. The moon card produced yet another distinctive reaction. The woman picked it up and held it for a long time, turning it over in her hands, studying the image with what appeared to be a mixture of fascination and dread. The howling wolves, the uncertain path between two towers, the face of the moon looking down with an expression that could be read as either benevolent or sinister, all of these details seemed to captivate her. She finally set the card down and said quietly, "This is where I live." These three cards, the devil, the tower, and the moon, became the focal points of Jung's therapeutic work with this patient over the following months. Each card, he came to understand, represented a different dimension of her shadow, a different category of material that she had pushed out of her conscious awareness. The devil, in Jung's archetypal framework, represented not evil but rather the primal, instinctual, earthly aspects of human nature. Sexuality, aggression, desire, ambition, the hunger for power, the pleasure of the body, the refusal to be bound by convention or expectation. The woman's violent reaction to this card revealed the enormous energy she had invested in repressing these fundamental drives. Her goodness was not simply a natural expression of her character, it was a fortress built to contain everything she had been taught to view as base or unacceptable. The tower represented the catastrophic potential of repression. When psychological material is pushed into the shadow for long enough, it accumulates pressure like water behind a dam. Eventually, the structure that contains it must fail. The Tower card depicts this moment of catastrophic release, the lightning bolt that shatters the carefully constructed edifice of the persona and releases everything that has been trapped within. The woman's response, that single word deserved, revealed an unconscious awareness that her constructed self was unsustainable and that its collapse was not only inevitable but perhaps even necessary. The moon represented the territory of the shadow itself, the dark, uncertain, ambiguous landscape that lies beyond the boundaries of conscious awareness. The woman's statement that "this is where I live" was perhaps the most revealing moment of the entire investigation. On one level, she meant that she lived in a state of uncertainty and confusion. But on a deeper level, she was acknowledging something far more significant, that her true self, the self she had spent a lifetime suppressing, existed in the moonlit territory of the unconscious, and that some part of her knew it. The therapeutic work that followed was neither easy nor comfortable. Jung used the three cards as anchoring points for their conversations, returning to them again and again as the woman gradually began to confront the material she had repressed. The process was slow and often painful. Each time she allowed herself to acknowledge a desire, an anger, a selfish impulse, she experienced waves of guilt and shame that threatened to overwhelm her. Jung later described this phase of the work as the descent, a period in which the patient must voluntarily enter the territory of their own shadow and begin to reclaim what has been lost. The Devil card became the vehicle for her reconnection with her own desires and instincts. In a series of sessions devoted to exploring what this card represented for her, the woman gradually began to acknowledge feelings and impulses she had never before allowed into consciousness. She admitted to feeling anger toward her mother, who had imposed impossible standards of goodness throughout her childhood. She acknowledged sexual desires that she had considered shameful. She recognized ambition and competitive feelings that she had always masked as altruistic concern for others. Each admission felt, in her words, like swallowing poison, but each also brought a corresponding sense of relief and vitality. The Tower card became the site of her confrontation with the unsustainability of her constructed self. Through their work together, the woman came to understand that her emptiness was not a mysterious affliction, but rather the natural consequence of having rejected so much of her own nature. The tower of her perfect persona would eventually fall whether she chose to dismantle it consciously or not. The question was whether the collapse would be deliberate and therapeutic or catastrophic and destructive. With Jung's guidance, she began the difficult work of voluntarily taking apart the structures she had spent a lifetime building. The Moon card became her guide to the unconscious territory she needed to explore. Rather than fearing the ambiguity and uncertainty that the Moon represented, she gradually learned to navigate it. She began paying attention to her dreams, which had been vivid and disturbing throughout her life, but which she had always dismissed as meaningless. She started noticing the subtle emotional responses that arose throughout her day, responses she had habitually suppressed before they could reach conscious awareness. The Moon's uncertain light, she came to understand, was not a threat but an invitation to see differently, to perceive the aspects of reality that the harsh light of conscious reason could not reveal. Jung documented this case extensively, and it became one of the foundational examples in his theory of shadow integration. But the implications of his work extended far beyond individual therapy. As he continued his investigation into the relationship between the tarot and the shadow, he began to uncover patterns that suggested something universal about how human beings related to their own darkness. One of the most striking patterns was what Jung called the symmetry of rejection. When he examined which tarot cards provoked the strongest aversive reactions in different individuals, he found a remarkable correspondence between the rejected cards and the person's conscious self-image. People who identified strongly with intellectualism and rationality tended to reject cards associated with emotion, intuition, and the body. People who prided themselves on their independence and strength reacted most strongly to cards suggesting vulnerability, dependence, or surrender. People who valued order and control were most disturbed by cards representing chaos, transformation, and the unknown. This symmetry suggested something profound about the nature of the shadow. It was not a random collection of repressed material. Rather, it was the precise complement of the conscious personality. Whatever a person most identified with, the opposite quality was most strongly represented in their shadow. The more rigidly a person defined themselves in terms of certain qualities, the more completely the opposite qualities were pushed into the unconscious. The shadow was, in effect, a perfect negative image of the persona, containing everything the persona excluded. This insight had implications that went far beyond individual psychology. Jung began to see the shadow principle operating at the level of cultures, institutions, and societies. Every culture that emphasized certain values automatically created a collective shadow composed of the opposite values. A culture that celebrated rationality and progress created a collective shadow of irrationality and regression. A society that valued individual achievement created a collective shadow of communal longing and interdependence. A civilization built on the principle of control created a collective shadow of wildness and chaos. The tarot, Jung observed, seemed to be one of the few cultural artifacts that acknowledged and depicted both sides of human nature without judgment. While most religious and philosophical systems divided human qualities into good and evil, acceptable and unacceptable, the tarot presented all aspects of human experience as equally valid and necessary. The hermit's withdrawal and the magician's engagement were given equal dignity. The emperor's order and the tower's destruction were presented as equally necessary. The sun's clarity and the moon's ambiguity were shown as complementary rather than opposed. This non-judgmental comprehensiveness, Jung suggested, was precisely what made the tarot such an effective tool for shadow work. Most therapeutic approaches struggled with the shadow because they implicitly reinforced the same value judgments that had created the shadow in the first place. A therapist who told a patient to accept their anger was still operating within a framework that treated anger as something that needed to be accepted rather than something that simply was. The tarot, by presenting all archetypal energies as inherent aspects of the human condition, offered a framework that transcended the good-bad dichotomy that kept the shadow in place. The investigation into the shadow and the tarot revealed several distinct mechanisms through which the cards facilitated encounters with repressed material. The first mechanism was what Jung called symbolic displacement. When a person looked at a tarot card, they were encountering their shadow material at a safe distance. The devil on the card was not their devil. It was an image, a symbol, something external and separate from them. This distance allowed the person to engage with shadow material without being overwhelmed by it. They could look at the devil card and acknowledge feelings of desire or aggression without having to admit that these feelings belonged to them. The card served as a container for shadow material, holding it in a form that could be examined without being consumed. The second mechanism was what later researchers would call affective resonance. The rich, multi-layered symbolism of the tarot cards seemed to activate emotional responses that bypassed the rational mind's defenses. A person could intellectually understand the concept of the shadow without ever truly encountering their own. But when confronted with a powerful visual symbol, the emotional response was immediate and unmediated. The body responded before the mind could construct its defenses. This was why Jung paid such close attention to physical responses, the quickened breath, the tensed muscles, the averted gaze. These bodily reactions revealed shadow material that the conscious mind was actively working to conceal. The third mechanism was narrative integration. The tarot's structure as a sequential journey, the Fool's Journey through all 22 major arcana, provided a framework for understanding the shadow not as something to be conquered or eliminated, but as a necessary stage in the process of becoming whole. When individuals saw their encounter with the shadow as part of a larger journey toward integration and wisdom, they were more willing to engage with it. The shadow was not the end of the story. It was a chapter that had to be read before the story could continue. A particularly powerful case that emerged from Jung's ongoing investigation involved a successful businessman who came to him complaining of recurring nightmares. In his dreams, he was pursued through dark corridors by a figure he could never quite see, but that filled him with terror. The nightmares had begun several years earlier, shortly after he had achieved significant professional success, and they had grown progressively more intense. When Jung laid out the tarot cards and asked the man to identify the card that most resembled the figure in his dreams, the man pointed without hesitation to the moon card. The shadowy landscape, the howling creatures, the uncertain path, these corresponded precisely to the dream imagery. But when Jung asked him to identify which card represented himself, the man chose the Chariot, the card of willpower, control, direction, and conquest. The therapeutic significance of this pairing was immediately clear to Jung. The Chariot and the moon represented opposing principles. The Chariot was about mastering external reality through force of will. The moon was about surrendering to inner reality, to the unconscious, to the unknown. The businessman had built his entire identity around the Chariot principle. He was a man of action, decision, and control. Everything in his life was organized, optimized, and directed toward specific goals. There was no room in this identity for uncertainty, vulnerability, or the unknown. His shadow, therefore, was composed precisely of these qualities. The moon, with its ambiguity, its shifting landscapes, its howling creatures of instinct, represented everything the businessman had pushed out of his conscious life. His nightmares were not attacks from some external force. They were communications from his own repressed nature, growing louder and more insistent as the gap between his persona and his shadow widened. The work with this patient followed a pattern that Jung would observe again and again. First, there was the initial encounter with the shadow through the tarot card, an encounter that produced strong emotional reactions. Then came the gradual recognition that the shadow material was not foreign but familiar, not threatening but necessary. Then the painful process of integration, of finding ways to incorporate shadow qualities into conscious life without being overwhelmed by them. For the businessman, this meant learning to tolerate uncertainty, to value intuition alongside analysis, to allow vulnerability into his relationships, and to recognize that not everything in life could or should be controlled. The process was neither linear nor comfortable. The businessman initially resisted fiercely. A man who had built an empire through force of will did not easily surrender to the formless territory of the moon. But the nightmares were his own unconscious demanding attention, and they would not relent until he responded. Gradually, through sustained work with the tarot imagery and the dreams it seemed to unlock, he began to develop a relationship with the aspects of himself he had spent a lifetime denying. Jung noted that the integration of shadow material through tarot work often followed a specific sequence. First, there was repulsion, the initial aversive reaction to the card that represented shadow material. Second, there was curiosity, a gradual shift from rejection to interest in the rejected card. Third, there was recognition, the moment when the person began to see their own qualities reflected in the card they had initially rejected. Fourth, there was integration, the process of consciously incorporating shadow qualities into one's lived experience. Fifth, and finally, there was transformation, a fundamental shift in the person's relationship with themselves and the world around them. This sequence mirrored the alchemical process that Jung had studied extensively, the transformation of base matter into gold. The shadow, like the alchemist's prima materia, was the raw, unrefined material from which psychological wholeness could be forged. But just as the alchemical process required the practitioner to work with substances that were toxic, foul-smelling, and dangerous, the process of shadow integration required the person to engage with aspects of themselves that felt repulsive, shameful, and threatening. The investigation into the tarot and the shadow also revealed something counterintuitive about the nature of goodness. Jung observed that the people who seemed most afraid of their shadow were often those who had invested most heavily in being good. The woman who had been taught to be endlessly kind and selfless had one of the most powerful and disturbing shadows he had ever encountered. Her suppressed anger, when it finally began to surface, was volcanic. Her repressed desires, when acknowledged, were fierce and demanding. The more completely she had rejected these qualities, the more powerful they had become in the unconscious. This observation led Jung to one of his most provocative insights, that excessive goodness was itself a form of psychological pathology. Not because goodness was wrong, but because the compulsive pursuit of goodness required the systematic rejection of essential parts of human nature. A person who was always kind was not whole. They were divided, with one half living in the light and the other half imprisoned in darkness. True psychological health, Jung argued, required not the elimination of dark qualities, but their conscious integration. A person who knew their own capacity for anger and chose to act with kindness was fundamentally different from a person who denied their anger entirely. The first was making a conscious choice. The second was living in a state of unconscious compulsion. The tarot depicted this truth with remarkable clarity. In the major arcana, the journey toward wholeness passed through both light and dark territories. The fool encountered not only the benevolent figures of the Empress and the Star, but also the challenging figures of the Devil and the Tower. Attempting to skip these stages, to reach the World card without passing through the territory of the shadow, was not just impossible, but dangerous. The unlived shadow material would eventually demand expression, and the longer it was denied, the more destructive its eventual emergence would be. Subsequent researchers expanded on Jung's work with the tarot and the shadow in several important directions. Some developed specific therapeutic protocols using tarot cards as diagnostic tools for identifying shadow material. Others explored how group work with tarot cards could reveal collective shadow patterns within organizations and communities. Still others investigated the relationship between the shadow and creativity, finding that artists who consciously engaged with their shadow material through tarot work often experienced breakthroughs in their creative expression. One researcher documented a series of cases in which individuals who had been stuck in creative blocks for years experienced sudden breakthroughs after sustained engagement with their shadow through tarot imagery. A novelist who had been unable to write convincing villains discovered that her shadow contained exactly the qualities she needed to bring depth and authenticity to her antagonists. A painter who had been producing technically skilled but emotionally flat work found that by meditating on the cards that disturbed him most, he could access emotional depths that transformed his art. A musician who had been trapped in a narrow range of expression discovered, through her work with the Moon and Devil cards, a capacity for darkness, intensity, and raw emotional power that she had never allowed herself to express. These cases suggested that the shadow was not simply a repository of rejected negative qualities. It was also the storehouse of unlived potential, of creative energies that had been suppressed along with the darker impulses. When a person learned to deny their anger, they often also learned to deny their passion. When they suppressed their aggression, they often also suppressed their assertiveness and drive. The shadow contained not only what was dark, but also what was vital, and reclaiming shadow material often meant reclaiming access to one's full range of human experience and expression. The questions that emerged from this investigation remain profoundly challenging. How could a person integrate shadow material without being overwhelmed by it? Where was the line between acknowledging dark impulses and acting on them? How could one maintain ethical behavior while also honoring the full range of human nature? These questions pushed the boundaries of conventional psychology and morality, demanding a more nuanced understanding of human nature than most frameworks could provide. Jung's answer to these questions was characteristically paradoxical. Integration of the shadow did not mean acting out every suppressed impulse. Rather, it meant becoming conscious of the full range of one's nature and making deliberate choices about how to express that nature. A person who had integrated their shadow knew they were capable of anger, selfishness, cruelty, and destruction. This knowledge did not make them dangerous. On the contrary, it made them safer because they were no longer at the mercy of unconscious forces they refused to acknowledge. The most dangerous person, Jung argued, was not the one who knew their own darkness, but the one who denied it entirely and therefore could not see when it was driving their behavior. The tarot, in this framework, served as a technology of consciousness, a tool for making visible what had been hidden, for bringing into awareness what had been denied. The cards that a person feared most were precisely the cards they most needed to understand. The images that provoked the strongest aversive reactions were the images that held the key to their psychological freedom. The shadow, once confronted and integrated, became not an enemy but an ally, a source of strength, creativity, and authentic selfhood that could never be accessed as long as it remained in darkness. The legacy of Jung's investigation into the tarot and the shadow continues to shape how therapists, educators, and individuals approach the work of self-understanding. The insight that what we reject in ourselves becomes our greatest obstacle and potentially our greatest resource remains one of the most powerful ideas in modern psychology. And the tarot, that ancient deck of illustrated cards, continues to serve as one of the most effective mirrors ever created for revealing the hidden face that each of us carries within, waiting to be seen, waiting to be known, waiting to be welcomed home. The fundamental mystery persists, not why we have a shadow, but why we work so hard to deny it. Not why dark qualities exist within us, but why we exhaust ourselves pretending they do not. The tarot does not answer these questions directly. Instead, it does something far more valuable. It lays the cards on the table, all of them light and dark alike, and invites us to look. What we do with what we see is up to us. But the first step, the essential step, the step that everything else depends on, is simply the willingness to look at what has been hidden and to recognize it as our own.